Well, welcome back to my intermediate writing or intermediate composition class. It's been a while, I know. Hope you had a nice, well, not enjoyable, but productive and successful midterm week, my students. Well, welcome to the second half of my class. So let me give you a brief overview of the second half. I'm going to change things up a little bit, depart from the syllabus a little bit, especially for the first couple of weeks here. Weeks 9, 10, 11. The second half, I'm going to start actually talking more about sources and cover some more points about using sources and types of sources. One reason is I think I want to do that first and give you some homework assignments related to that and related to source use and paraphrasing, and then talk about some points later after you've done some homework assignments. Then we're going to talk about exposition paragraphs or exposition writing, expositional as in explanatory kinds of writing, and analytical writing, analytical paragraphs analysis, and of course, some argumentation and style stuff later in the semester. But I also want to include a section on case studies, because we're going to be talking about case studies, and you're going to do that for the final paper in this class. More on what those are later. But I've had you do proposals for the midterm, and before the midterm, a sort of a job application writing assignment, because I want this class to be somewhat practical for your future needs. Whether you're going on for more academic studies, or for the majority of you who probably will end up working for companies. You're doing proposals, job application materials, and then case studies later. Because this reflects the kinds of writings you might be doing if you're working in companies later, or even if you go on for further studies, in an academic track. And for many of you, you're going to get jobs in the business world. And if you don't know what to do with your major, you may be wondering, why am I here? Well, this is a good route for you. Companies don't just need people with analytical skills like, not just business concepts, but the kind of soft skills that you all have. If you think about it, what kind of skills do companies need, especially international companies? Well, they need people with language skills like you. If you're not satisfied with your language skills, you can improve those on your own through doing a lot of reading and writing and exposing yourself to English media and practicing on your own. Language skills. Along with that, the cross-cultural skills, understanding other cultures. Those are important skills if you're going to work at a company. The analytical skills you get from studying a language and from studying linguistics, from studying literature, from studying a lot of things in college. The analytical skills you get from those kinds of things. And also the cognitive flexibility, that is the ability to adapt to new situations, to adapt to new problems, to maybe take your analytical skills you've learned in, say, something very different and apply them to a new situation. Cognitive flexibility. So this kind of major, a language or humanities major, can prepare you for a job in the business world, especially international business. If you don't know what to do with your life, think about that. I wish I had done that when I was younger. Yes, I still would have wanted to become a professor as I am now. I don't regret that. But I wish I had maybe spent a few years in the business world and gotten some experience there. But I didn't. And I kind of wish I could. But I'm interested in that angle a little bit, and I am looking into including more of that stuff in this course as I teach this course and revise this course in the coming years. So case studies you're going to be doing later on for the final. And whether you're more business oriented or academically oriented, this will be useful for you. A case study is when you do sort of an in-depth analysis of one company. Now in other fields it could be like one person, but in this class we're talking about companies, organizations. This can be like companies corporations, big companies, little companies that you're looking at, maybe a company that you would like to work at someday, where you can choose that for a case study for your final. You can also do a case study, analyzing the growth and success, problems, challenges, prospects of a company, but also any other kind of organization, community organizations, charities, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, government agencies, governments, and how they function, how governments handle a particular problem. That can be a case study. A particular educational institution or program. You can do especially if you're more academic, you can do an analysis of a particular educational program, educational policy, a particular school or university, whether it's a middle school or a university or a department at a university or some educational policy or program. There are lots of things you can do for a case study. So start thinking about what kind of topic you might like to do for your final. What kind of organization, company, entity, thing you would like to look at. Today I'm going to talk more about support and sources, and next time we're going to talk more about news sources. And then after that, we're going to talk more about professional sources. I want to go more in depth into some of these points. So, sources this will relate to your final, by the way. So let's talk about support and sources. Whenever you're writing something, especially an academic paper or a college essay, you probably know, hopefully understand by now, you have to use and cite sources. And there are good reasons for that. The famous scientist Sir Isaac Newton talked about how he liked to, his stuff was not his ideas. They just didn't come out of the blue, out of nowhere. But as he said, I stand on the shoulder of giants. That has kind of a double meaning, because one, he was kind of building on, the research of any scientist, physical scientist before him and the work that they had done. And he was just exploring very new things, new ideas, but it was always based on or maybe in reaction against, ideas of other scientists before him. There's a second meaning because he had this strong rivalry with another scientist and philosopher named Leibniz, and he kind of tried to push down. And he was kind of standing on him and trying to push him down. Okay, but that's another matter. Let me give you an example of source use and non-source use. I remember when I was in grad school, I was in the PhD program, and I took many courses in psycholinguistics. That's the psychology of language. And in one course, we read what was actually kind of a famous article in the field dealing with semantics. Semantics, the study of meaning. And of course, linguists and philosophers have done that for a long time, kind of analyzing logically how words mean what they mean and how we understand meaning. And the psychologists are interested in this too from a somewhat different angle. How does that work in the mind and in the brain? So we read this fairly famous article, a well-known article, at least it was at the time. It was from, I think, the 1970s. It was kind of old. And we read it and thought, oh, this is very interesting. Okay. And you get to the end of the article, there are no sources at all. Today, that kind of article would never get published. And I'm surprised it got published then. The idea seemed interesting, but as we read it and then we discussed it in class, we kind of ended up ripping it apart, criticizing it severely, because the ideas were really it was restating what was actually some old ideas. Go back a long time ago, they were just restating it, and the explanations of their ideas at first seemed really interesting. But as we thought about them, as we discussed them and analyzed them, we realized this doesn't really work. This would fall apart, especially based on what we know now today about the human mind, all that. This does not work. This was garbage. We ended up trashing the article. And one of the problems was it didn't cite any sources. If they had bothered to cite sources, they might have said, well, actually, our ideas are similar to what Plato and Aristotle said. Well, okay, then how are your ideas different than what Plato and Aristotle said about how meaning and ideas work in the mind? They didn't think about that. They didn't really think about even the research, actual research in psychology at the time the article was written. They didn't think about that. So the article ended up repeating some old ideas just in different words and different phrases, but without any scientific basis, and the science would have just destroyed it. Or it would have forced them, if they'd looked at what the science had to say, at least at their time, it would have forced them to rethink their ideas a lot and maybe say things a lot differently and develop their ideas in a much better way. So not using sources means you can just end up reinventing what someone else said, and it will come across as poorly researched, poorly thought out ideas. Because unless you've got a PhD in something or a master's, you may not come up with something incredibly original that hasn't been done before. Or if you have, you still have to compare it with what other people have done and show how your ideas are really different and better. And in doing so, you have to improve upon your ideas and develop them better and explain them better by citing sources and what other people have said about the topic. So, surprising that article got published back then, and because it didn't cite sources, that's one of the reasons. It must be an embarrassment now for the scholars who wrote it, because it's just so easy to rip it apart and trash it. It has such serious logical flaws and scientific problems. So don't set yourself up for embarrassment like that. And when you cite sources, we want to use them intelligently and meaningfully. And so some pitfalls, some problems that people run into, and this is true for you or for a native English speaker at a college in the US or Canada who's writing a college paper for the first time. A student maybe goes to Google, does a Google search and comes up with a lot of articles. You're like, oh, these are really good information, good ideas from these articles, and you dump them in your paper, but you dump a lot of stuff. You quote too much information from the articles, which shows that you probably didn't really read it intelligently and digest it and understand it, and you just dump this information. And maybe you try to reword it properly, paraphrase it and summarize it properly, but you're dumping too much information, and it's an information dump. And the paper reads like an information dump. It doesn't have any logical flow because it's just a dump of information. This is a common problem for college students, even native English speakers, the information dump. And thus your paper is not going to really develop your ideas. There's information, but no ideas that are being developed and flowing throughout the paper. Intelligent source use is often citing only the important or relevant idea or information from a source, from an article or a book or a research publication. Only the important, relevant information, only the stuff that's important for your paper. And so oftentimes when you read how good writers cite sources, it's often maybe part of a sentence. Maybe one or two sentences at most at a time. Kind of extended citations where you have a big chunk of stuff that's all from a source, that's less common, unless maybe you're dealing with kind of stuff you're going to be reading and writing in graduate school in a master's or PhD program. It's not often that you're going to really need to have an extended citation. Except maybe in a literature paper where you're maybe going to have an extended direct quotation from, a novel or poem that you're analyzing, or what some scholar said about that that's important. So we use sources intelligently. So what are the functions? Well, one is exposition. I mentioned exposition. Explanation, explaining something to us. Maybe explaining the background of this issue, explaining the problem that other people have talked about and what other people have said. Explaining something, explaining the issue, explaining the background, explaining the issue that you're analyzing or talking about. Sources can be cited to show, in order to show a need or problem. Here's a source that points out and explains the problem or the need here that we need to address in the research. Or these scholars or scientists have looked at this and this and this, but they haven't looked at this, or they haven't looked at this very well, but I'm going to look at this. You use sources to show a need or a problem. Whether you identify the problem, you're citing sources that have identified the problem or a need. So for example, in your proposal assignments, you hopefully cited a source that might have explained, depending on the kind of topic you're doing, you might have needed to cite a source to explain the need that you're addressing in your proposal. Whether it's somebody else commenting on the need, or this community needs this kind of program, this kind of help, or this is a problem this community needs, as this social researcher has pointed out, and so my project is going to try to address that. Sources can be used for developing your analysis, helping, getting ideas for your explanation, for your analysis from other sources, maybe citing some kind of an explanation that somebody has developed for a similar problem and applying it to your own, or comparison and contrast. Well, this is what somebody has said, but my idea is differently. So let's say you're doing a case study for the final. Let's say you're looking at some, the rise of a particular tech company, and you might cite sources for exposition background. A news or business news magazine that describes how this company grew and what this company is doing or trying to do now. Maybe sources from business research articles or business news articles or business analysis articles that talk about the problem that a company is facing, pointing out the need, or a problem that the company likely will face, or evidence that you can cite for, say, this is why the company might have a problem here if it keeps doing this. Developing an analysis, maybe finding an article. Look at what the famous tech company Yahoo went through and the mistakes that they made. Well, this company is making similar mistakes. You can cite a source. Yahoo did this according to this article, and you see the company I'm talking about, they're making, or in danger of making, similar mistakes. Different explanations and such. Comparison and contrast with other ideas. Well, this business researcher thinks that the company should do this, or has a problem here, or I just maybe agree or disagree with that analysis. That's why you would cite sources. In terms of citing sources, we need to talk about plagiarism. We mentioned it before. That's really important. Plagiarism means you don't cite the source unless it's common knowledge. Okay, yeah, we know that Microsoft is a big tech company that's famous for its Office software and its operating systems. Okay, you don't. But if it's any specific data that is not common knowledge, their sales figures, their strategies, information about their performance, their market share, okay, that you would need to cite, or different opinions from different business scholars about, their strategies or what they should or should not do, you would cite that. And you would reword it. You would paraphrase or summarize it. Paraphrasing, summarizing, kind of similar. I'll use them interchangeably. Summarizing means you shorten it. When you shorten something, you paraphrase it. Paraphrasing means changing the wording. And when you change the wording, you probably shorten it a little bit or a lot. Okay, so paraphrasing, summarizing, they are kind of similar. Rewording. When you use sources, again, you only cite the key ideas or key information from a source that's relevant to your paper, to your case study, or your proposal. Rewording involves what? Well, you combine sentences, maybe you change content words when possible. So content words, the important words like nouns, verbs, and adjectives, you change them when possible. Now, you can't sometimes change them like they're technical terms. You can't change technical terms and special expressions, but common content words, when possible, you change them with synonyms when it's possible, and shorten things. Try to avoid direct quotations. A lot of times students use direct quotations and it's often lazy. Now, there are times when it's valid, when you are, again, citing a passage from a novel. If you do so, put that direct quotation in and then talk about it. What does it show? Don't just throw in direct quotations into your paper and then go on. Then it just looks like you're just throwing it in there to fill up space. If you have a direct quotation, okay, put it in there, but then explain what it means, or explain why you put it in there, or explain something about the passage. It might be a passage from a novel or a poem that you're analyzing. You might quote a scholar who talks about this poem or this poet, and you would only do that if there is something really important and special about what that person said. Otherwise, when possible, paraphrase, summarize, and cite it. Direct quotations are for special instances, and you should say something about the direct quotation. Otherwise, it looks lazy. So really be careful with direct quotations. Only use them when necessary. Okay, so here I'm kind of rambling about a bunch of different stuff, like a crazy old man, which I am, a crazy old professor. And don't cite Wikipedia. Okay, last part of my rant. Don't cite Wikipedia. Every semester I say don't cite Wikipedia, and every semester some student cites Wikipedia. Please don't do that. Okay, it's not good for my heart, for my health. It's not good. Don't do it. Next video, I'm going to talk more about types of support, types of sources in a little more detail than what we've done before. Homework assignments, you'll have maybe a couple of Google Forms that are based on passages in the book in my book where you'll look at some examples of citations and summarizing and paraphrasing, and I want you to comment on whether you think that they are appropriate, whether they are either plagiarism or not, or whether they are just intelligent or poor use of sources in writing. And then after that, I'm going to give you a paragraph writing assignment. I'll say more about it later, or I'll explain it in the LMS. I've got a couple of short essays in the book, and I think it's in chapter 4, about education issues. There are a couple of short essays in there. I'm going to ask you to read those and then write a response to one of them in a paragraph writing assignment. Write a response to one of those essays. I think it's section 4.2 in my book. Then I've got some short essay samples, reading samples in my book in chapter 5, and I want you to read those. I'm going to talk about those. I was going to give you a lot of assignments about all of those readings in chapter 5. I probably cut back on those, maybe just a couple of Google Form assignments. And I'll talk about those later. Those are examples of exposition and analysis that I want to talk about later on, or maybe next week or the week after that. So read the sample writings, sample essays in chapters 4 and 5. You're going to, again, have to write a response, write something in response to one of those in chapter 4 about education issues. One is about university education, one is about English fever in Korea. And then the samples in chapter 5, which we will talk about. And some of those samples in chapter 5 are sort of case studies of companies and such, which we will look at. And what we learn about in terms of case studies for companies, you can also use those if you want to do a case study of an organization, a government agency, a school, an education program. They will all be kind of similar in principle. Okay, next video, types of support, academic and non-academic sources. So see you soon. Goodbye.